So consumer surplus is defined as the difference between marginal benefit and marginal cost of production. Total social surplus, that is remained after netting out deadweight loss. The very most that a consumer is willing to pay for a good. The difference between willingness to pay and price summed across consumers. So the consumer surplus, it's that triangle, the top triangle that we've been talking about, right? The demand tells us the maximum willingness to pay, right? But that maximum willingness to pay differs for different consumers. That's why you have that downward sloping demand curve, right? So the right answer is D, which seems to be the prevalent answer for most people. Right? Okay. If the supply is not perfectly elastic, a rightward shift in demand curve for soda will result in an increase in the equilibrium quantity of soda that is smaller than the increase in demand. Now let's think about that for a quick second. What we really mean by that is the following. If your demand is like this, and it increases by some particular measure, the way we measure this increase is this horizontal shift, if you like, okay? This is by how much that demand increases, because for any given price, that's the extra quantity that's being demanded, okay? So you can think of that as the... If, however, your supply is not perfectly elastic, meaning it's not flat, then the change in quantity will be just this bit here as compared to the change in demand, which is this whole bit here. And that's why this question here should have been true. And yeah, we see a few B's there as well. Okay, fine. If the price of bottled water falls 20% and the elasticity of demand is -2, then the quantity of bottled water sold will. Okay, what's elasticity? Is the relationship between percentage change in price and percentage change in quantity. It's an inverse relationship, so when the price of bottled water falls, you would expect an increase in quantity. So D and E will be out. And when the price of water falls by 1%, you should expect a quantity increase by 2%. When it falls by 20%, you should expect twice as high, so 40%. Okay? 4. Which of the following causes the supply curve for t-shirt to shift down and right? So think of supply, okay? Supply is shifting down and right, okay? Which is the same thing as thinking about costs going lower, right? A change in the minimum wage that increases the labor cost for workers who make t-shirts. Well, that increases cost. It doesn't decrease those costs, okay? A new technology in the factory that reduces the cost of producing t-shirt. Well, if costs are reduced, then you should expect the supply, right, to go down. Or think of supply. When you think of supply, I think of marginal cost of productions. Okay? So when it goes down, or when it goes to the right, if you like, your cost of productions are going lower. Right? An increase in the price of cotton that makes purchasing material more costly, that's the inverse. An increase in the demand from a neighboring country, that increase in demand might well lead to a higher output, but it doesn't change your cost structure. Okay, so your supply doesn't change. So in part D, there is no change. In part A and part C, the change is the opposite, and B is the only answer. Because, see, look, you have another few months to prepare for this exam, okay? You have another few months to prepare for this exam, and all of you manage to finish this in 30 minutes, okay? You'll have an hour for this in an exam, at least on a points-based system. So you have plenty of time, and one thing that I would recommend doing is, besides finding the right answer, convince yourself that the other answers are not right, okay? Think of that as a double-checking mechanism, because you have plenty of time, right? So you should do that. Anyone with a show of hands that thinks that they've made a mistake that they could have avoided in this first four? Yeah. So you want to basically you don't want to say, I wish I'd thought a bit more carefully about this multiple choice question. In the long questions, you'll get partial marks, right? It will be obvious that you've made a silly mistake. That's why you didn't get the right answer or whatever. But here there is no middle ground, right? So if you miss any marks, miss them on the things that you really just didn't know. Don't miss them on the things that you did know, but you just couldn't quite make it out. Okay, suppose that you're thinking about spending an additional hour studying for your next exam. You use the concept of opportunity cost when making the decision. You should spend that extra hour of studying as long as the extra study time leads to a higher grade on the exam. What is that answer telling you? It's ignoring the cost that comes with that extra study time, right? So it's only focusing on the benefits, right? It's saying as long as the benefits are non-zero, you should do it, but it's completely ignoring the cost. The change in marginal benefit from studying is increasing. Again, focusing on the benefit, nothing to do on the cost. The change in marginal cost from studying is not increasing. Again, focusing on the cost, completely ignoring the benefits. The benefits of an additional hour of study is greater than what you have to give up in order to study. So that's the cost-benefit analysis definition. So if you had gone to those points A, B, C, you really should have convinced yourself that none of those were the right answer and why that was the case before you jump onto D. Let me just ask you maybe a question to kind of imagine that you really like video games, okay? And imagine you also like to do well on the exam. But you really like video games, okay? And then imagine that you apply this type of analysis for 10 minutes of studying versus 10 minutes of playing a video game. Okay? If you think about it, 10 minutes of study, you're just going to set yourself up, make yourself a cup of tea, right? Figure out the right things, right? That extra 10 minutes of study, it's not really going to add that much benefit to your final grade, right? So imagine if you do this cost-benefit analysis of 10 minutes of video game, 10 minutes of study, and you end up spending the whole night playing a video game, right? What's the problem with that analysis, right? Why couldn't you do this cost-benefit analysis in that video game, and why did that fail you?
Because 10 minutes are not enough to judge the results of that.
Yeah, that studying has increasing marginal benefits, right? Those marginal benefits might be very low initially, but they're increasing. So if you have this marginal cost, marginal benefit with a short-sighted view, you might end up in a very bad sort of like situation. Okay. Okay. Consider the political debate in a small country considering tobacco. Politician A claims that because 100 cartons of cigarettes per day are sold at 10, a $1 tax will bring in at least 90 pounds per day. What's the mistake that politician is making? If I make a £1 tax, he is assuming that the number of cartoons that are going to be consumed is going to be exactly the same, right? Politician B claims this tax will decrease the number of cartoons smoked by at least a half. News organization report that this tax will bring in 90 pounds of revenue and cutting smoking in half, making this as no-brainer tax because it's all benefits at no cost. Okay, so this bit here, remember we talked a little bit about in our last class on the who bears the tax revenue and the cost, right? If I put on a tax, right, that tax will be shared between consumers and producers. that tax will change the price, but how much it will change the price, it will depend on the relative elasticities of consumers and producers. Okay, so if I put a tax of £1, it will increase my price by £1 if the demand is perfectly inelastic, right? And it will be some middle ground, right? If there is elasticity. Right? So politician A is assumed that the elasticity of demand for tobacco in terms of magnitude is less than 1. Politician B is assuming the elasticity of demand for tobacco in magnitude is greater than 5. They cannot be both correct. So, of course, this news organization, really the punchline here is to realize that the conclusion of this news organizations cannot both hold true, right? It was silly to combine those two things together. Okay. Right. This question here, you will be discussing it a little bit more when it comes to when Ignacio will do his final lecture. Okay. So if you didn't quite do this question fully, don't worry too much about it. Okay. You were not quite at the stage of doing this question 6 in full. You could have done a good guess, but not have done it in full. Your town is considering implementing one of two taxes. One tax assesses gas station an extra 0.10 per liter sold. The other tax assesses people who stay at hotels and charges £20 per night. Gasoline demand is more inelastic than gasoline supply, and hotel demand is more elastic than hotel supply. Okay, there was one punchline that I gave you in the last class. What was that punchline? The relatively more inelastic party will bear the cost of the tax or the benefit of the subsidy. So in this case, all you have to figure out is which are the relatively more inelastic party. They will pay the burden, and that is summarized by C. So the gas on tax station will mostly be paid for by consumers because demand is more inelastic than the supply in the gasoline market. The tax on hotel will mostly be paid by hotel businesses because in that market demand is more elastic than supply. Okay. Assume the demand for oranges is given by 10 minus P. Demand for apple is given by 100 minus P at a price of 2 for oranges and apples. Okay, so I look at the different answers. The different answers are comparing elasticities, right? The different answers are comparing elasticities. So what we will need to do is draw those two. We can draw those two functions and figure out the elasticities of the different bits. So one way that you could go about this is to say, right, one demand is 10 minus P, the other is 100 minus P. The price is 2. Okay. Yeah. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to assess the elasticity at A and elasticity at B. Of course, one way to do this is to, of course, just calculate the elasticity at those 2 points. You could do that, right? All you have to do to calculate the elasticity of these 2 points, figure out what QA is, figure out what QB is, and then say elasticity at point A in absolute value will be equal to 1 over the slope, which is 1, times price, which is 2, over QA. What's the elasticity at point B? Is 1 over the slope, which is 1, times 2, which is the price, over QB. But did you really need to calculate those? You really didn't, because you're only being asked to compare them. And it's very clear from that graph that for any given price, if the slope is the same, right, the further away is the quantity, this bit here is going to have a higher quantity, so this is going to be lower. Sorry, this is going to be lower than this. Okay, so epsilon A, elasticity at A, is going to be more elastic, right? Demand for oranges, which was our oranges. Oranges was our demand for oranges, demand for apple. So this were the demand for oranges, demand for apples. Demand for oranges is more elastic than apples, and both demands are inelastic. How do you know that both demands are inelastic? Let's study that for a second. The way we divided elasticity is if you go to the midpoint of 50, that's where the elasticity would be 1. If you go at the midpoint of 5, that's where the elasticity would be 1. So in that area over there, it would be less than 1. So it will be inelastic. Okay. Everybody's with me on this one? So we could go through the other answers as well, right? Demand for orange is more elastic than apples, true, and demand for apples is inelastic, but not the demand for oranges, that's incorrect. Demand for oranges is more elastic than apples, correct, and both demands are elastic, that's incorrect. Both demands are inelastic, but then the order is different here. The demand for orange, wrong, is more elastic, and both demands are elastic, also wrong. A subsidy is split between producers and consumers in a competitive market with standard supply and demand curves. Consumers will get the majority of the benefit from the subsidy when demand is inelastic relative to supply. Again, what was the punchline of last week's class? The parties that are relatively more inelastic either bear the burden or the benefit. So if I have a subsidy, the more inelastic party will bear that benefit. Okay? The majority of the benefit is where the demand is inelastic.
Why isn't it also A?
Producers don't know about the subsidy. Oh, because it doesn't matter. So the basically in a perfectly competitive market, right? Imagine that half of the room is buyers, okay, and the other half of the room you're sellers, okay. But there's loads of you, so you're kind of like in a sense price takers, right? You kind of look at the market. Let's say that you make, I don't know, tomatoes, right? And I go as a state, I don't tell you, okay? I keep it quiet. I go to all the suppliers, to the producers here, buyers, sorry, and I tell them I'm going to give you some subsidy. You don't need to know about that. You'll realize that more people are rushing to buy your tomatoes, right? And maybe you go home a little bit earlier, right? So you say, well, maybe I should raise the price a little bit, right? So the fact that I give them vouchers and you don't know about it doesn't mean that you won't know about their increased demand about your products, right? And that will still cause a potential rise into the price, okay? And it depends on the relative subsidy, right? So if, for example, you have a fixed number of tomatoes, so you always sell a fixed number of tomatoes, right? Then the subsidy will simply increase the price of tomatoes. Who will bear that cost? Who will bear that benefit? You, the suppliers. So
Well, that's only if they know about the subsidy, right?
No, they don't need to know. They just need to know about increased demand, right? Like you don't need to know what caused their desire to buy apples or tomatoes or anything. What you know is that all of a sudden, no, they want to buy more stuff, right? Okay. In game theory, Nash equilibrium is always the worst outcome for one of the players. That is false. Okay. In a Nash equilibrium, no one has an incentive to unilaterally deviate, so that should have been hopefully okay for everyone. Was it okay for everyone? We have a C. Mostly okay for everyone. Okay, 11. Julia and Zach are the only consumers of milk in the market. Julia's market demand curve for milk is blah, at prices below 4 and 0 for price above 4. Zach's demand is blah, at price below 5 and 0 price. If the market price is 4.50, note, if it's 4.50, Julia doesn't buy. The only buyer is Zach. At prices of 4.50, you have 10 minus 2 times 4.50. 10 minus 9 is equal to 1 unit of milk. Right? So read the questions carefully, okay, in this type of situations. You're scheduled to receive £100 1 year from today. The interest rate at which you can invest money is 25% per year. Suppose you're offered Y today in exchange for giving up the right to receive £100 in 1 year. You only care about net present value. So the smallest Y you will accept is this bit here. What are you doing? You are? Yes, exactly. 100 divided by 1.25, that's 80, or you can confirm that if you take 80 and you multiply it by 1.25, you will get 100. So the net present value of the 100 is 80. Let me take some questions now. You can point to any question. Question 1, question 3, whatever questions you have. Can I get a sort of like a bit of nodding or a bit of shock? How many of you think that they lost one or more questions just for carelessness? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I will stop this here.